Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Alan. Good to see you.
Hi. Hello. Hi, I'm Taylor. Nice to meet you. Heard a lot about you. Oh, no. I don't know. Yeah, is that your perspective on kind of what went wrong?
Well, I'm interested to hear what she says, and then we'll have another panel with other legislators. I'm interested to hear what they say, particularly Mona Das, who's not running for re-election and therefore might be more candid. Both the ADU bill and the middle housing bill died in Democratic caucus.
Yep. Died where?
In the Democratic caucus.
Yep. Thank you so much for coming to this panel on federal housing policy. My name is Taylor Smiley Wolf. I have she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy and Planning at Home Forward. We're the housing authority for Multnomah County, which is the largest provider of affordable housing in the state of Oregon and definitely in Multnomah County. And I'm joined today by Mike.
Hi, everyone. Mike Kingsello, CEO of Up for Growth. We're a national pro-housing member network based in Washington, D.C.
And I'm also on the board of Up for Growth. And for folks that are sitting kind of in the middle and back, if you feel, I'm always a back of the classroom student for sure. But if you're willing to come up close to the front, that would be great. We're going to have some discussion session at the end of the presentation. So at least make sure you're sitting next to one other person. So yeah, coming up if you like. Otherwise, just find a partner, someone who you can chat with. We're going to definitely have this be a really generative panel. So
yeah, thank you, Taylor. And as Taylor said, the idea here is to have a generative conversation. So excited to have everybody in this room here, leaders from coast to coast. And in fact, I see John from London. Welcome. So excited to have an international perspective as well. As Taylor said, Up for Growth is a national organization. We have a 501c4 legislative advocacy affiliate called Up for Growth Action, which is focused on advancing pro-housing policies in Congress and advocating before the administration. So the idea for this program is to have roughly 20 minutes of context setting. I'll present sort of a brief lay of the land, what's going on the Hill, some of the dynamics at play, what's emerging. We really want to spend at least 2/3 of the time really generating ideas from all of you, because our goal at Up for Growth Action is to advance policies at the federal level that's going to make it easier and create more paths for local and statewide pro-housing advocates to be more effective. So we really want to hear from you as far as what we should be prioritizing as we think about our legislative agenda through the rest of 2022 and then into 118th Congress. So I'll just kick us off because I think it's important to acknowledge that really there are two drivers of the housing affordability challenge in this nation. Of course, one is what we call housing underproduction, which is to say that the United States fell millions of homes short of meeting housing needs from 2000 to 2015. In fact, new research forthcoming from Up for Growth finds that underproduction, the shortage, doubled in the U.S. from 2012 to 2019. Certainly the pandemic has accelerated these trends. So the shortage is a big part of the story. But the second part of the story, obviously, is 4 decades of wage stagnation in widening income inequality. If you think about the black versus white homeownership gap, it's never been wider than it is today since 1968. 50% of American households, renter households, are experiencing cost burdening, paying more than 30% of their gross paycheck on rent. Full quarter paying more than 50% of the gross paycheck on rent. So we have a dire housing crisis, and it's really the confluence of demand side challenges and supply side challenges that's driving the housing crisis. So our group, Up for Growth Action, is really singularly focused on that latter half of the problem. And we're advocating for federal policies to address national housing underproduction. And we partner with and support and work in coalition with organizations that are very much focused on the demand side, whether that is tenant protections or legislation related to housing stability or things like housing choice vouchers for low-income households. So this is really just kind of a high-level overview of where we're focused. I'd say 80 to 90% of our work as an organization is really pushing on solving the shortage. And that really boils down into 2 prongs, 2 co-equal parts. The first is the more traditional role of Congress, and that's funding. Programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, new proposals like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is really about putting back into service aged housing stock, where folks are running into what's called the appraisal gap. Basically pumping more capital and resource into the system to build the types of housing, whether it's low income, affordable, mixed income, middle income, or even rural rental housing. Projects where the private sector left to its own devices can't build sufficient housing. That's more of a traditional role for Congress. Second area we're focused on, and this is really the more nascent and exciting area that we're pushing hard on the Hill, is really getting at zoning reform, getting at eliminating exclusionary and restrictive zoning, discriminatory land use policies, the patterns and policies that over the years have perpetuated not only a housing shortage, but perpetuated racial and economic inequity. And so that's really the more nascent area of our advocacy. And when you look at our agenda, you'll really see that's where our focus is. So let's talk sort of the map. So the good news is, as you all know, working on the ground, I think in most cases, pro-housing policy is a bipartisan issue. The bad news is opponents to pro-housing policy are also bipartisan. From our perspective, though, the organized opposition to bills like the Yes in My Backyard Act or the Build More Housing Near Transit Act aren't as vociferous as they are at the local level. And over 4 short years, we went from literally having 0 bills related to zoning reform, exclusionary zoning, artificial barriers at the federal level, to now a significant list of bills introduced by members of Congress in both chambers and on both sides of the aisle. This is just a matrix so you can get a sense of the diversity of sponsors of pro-housing legislation, equally balanced between right and left. And importantly, it's not just the coasts. We have members in Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, Delaware. It's coastal, but it's not exactly the coast you'd think of, right, when it comes to pro-housing policy. So we're really building a legislative coalition of pro-housing champions. Each of these folks, most of them are sponsoring not one, but at least 2 pieces of federal pro-housing legislation. Now, I'm going to focus in on the non-funding legislation real quick, just to give everyone a sense of where the Overton window is at this point in time. So First, I'll speak to approaches. In our experience, working this issue over the past several years, there's basically three general approaches federal legislators can take to pushing zoning reform and supporting state and local governments to tackle barriers. One is providing resources. We'll talk about some specific bills in a bit, but really how can we provide capacity and resources, whether technical or monetary, to local and state governments working this issue on the ground. Number two, setting policies in connection with federal policies and programs that exist, right? Like, so think about grant programs. We're working on a bill called the Build More Housing Near Transit Act, which would apply some pro-housing scoring criteria to fixed guideway capital investment grants, which are the grants that are used to construct light rail, streetcar, commuter rail, really sort of getting at our communities doing the work to say, this is what we're going to build around the proposed transit line we're wanting the federal government to step in and fund. And then finally, incentivizing specific actions through challenge grants, competitive grants, otherwise new funding from the federal level, right? So you can think of it as either you're going to create more of a stick, which is tying conditions on existing federal funding streams, or you could create new pots of money that are made available to communities that make certain specific actions or achieve certain specific outcomes. I'm going to talk about the spectrum. So the continuum that we've mapped out here are from sticks, most famously Senator Booker and Majority Whip Clyburn's legislation now introduced 2 Congresses in a row called the Housing Opportunity, Mobility, and Equity, or HOME Act. This is a bill, when originally rolled out, would have tied certain pro-housing actions to be contingent on communities continuing to receive community development block grant funding. Now, that idea was a bit controversial, attacked from multiple directions for, I'd say, some good reasons. They have since expanded that to include surface transportation block grants, which is an approach we're more favorable towards. But that, really is the best example of a stick at the federal level. And again, it's been introduced in Congress 2 times, never had a markup, never had a specific hearing where it's moved, sort of a messaging bill, if you will. Then the next bucket is transparency. So this isn't telling communities what to do, but it's creating more transparency so federal policymakers can understand, essentially understand what's going on the ground, what outcomes are being driven by certain sets of policy actions at the local level, and that's the Yumby Act. This is a bill that was first introduced in the 116th Congress, bipartisan, bicameral, actually passed the House of Representatives on a unanimous consent vote on March 2nd, 2020, right before the pandemic. And so, rightly, congressional priorities shifted. The bill didn't end up moving across the finish line in the 116th Congress, but it has now been reintroduced in both chambers, has an endorsement coalition behind it of 250 organizations, from AARP to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition to all the sort of development trade associations to the National Fair Housing Alliance to Americans for Prosperity. So a really broad bipartisan coalition of folks that are for transparency, for more information on what pro-housing policies are being enacted on the ground. And then as we move further, I guess, to the right, we have the final 2 categories, which I would call catalysts and carrots. And I distinguish between catalysts and carrots. Often folks look at money proposed to be appropriated by Congress for zoning reform-related activities and immediately go to it's a carrot. I would argue that the Housing Supply and Affordability Act, which was sponsored by Senator Amy Klobuchar and Senator Rob Portman in the Senate, Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware, and Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, Republican of Washington, in the House, bipartisan. This bill proposes essentially a appropriation of $1.5 billion to be deployed over 5 years, so $300 million per year, to support zoning reform, technical work, so hiring consultants, staffing up at the city hall level, and doing community engagement, which Mrs. Klobuchar understands, was one of the key elements to moving Minneapolis 2040 across the finish line, right? That intentional community outreach to all communities across the city of Minneapolis to build that political will for those policies to move forward. So this is essentially creating a federal pot of money for cities to access through HUD to move forward zoning reform at scale. Now, I would say that this type of bill would not incentivize the Beverly Hills of the world, suddenly zone for more affordable housing, but there are a lot of cities in between Beverly Hills and Minneapolis. And I think there are a lot of cities that would like to move these types of policies from residential infill project, which is, I think, discussed here at this conference in Portland, to the recent affordable housing ordinance legislation out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? There are cities that want to move these forward, but they don't have the staff capacity. And these types of policies are nice to have to develop, not necessarily critical path. And what ultimately gets appropriated the money at the local level. So here's a dedicated resource to catalyze communities to taking steps towards zoning reform and moving policy to create abundant housing. But then, of course, there are real carrots. Maxine Waters, chair of the House Financial Services Committee, last Congress, again this Congress, introduced a bill called the Housing as Infrastructure Act, which essentially sets up a sidecar within the Community Development Block Grant Program to make communities whole for doing work associated with streamlining development approvals or right-sizing impact fees, which in her district in California writ large is a considerable issue, arguably impairing housing production. Another good example of this is the Affordable Housing Redevelopment Act, introduced by Senator Feinstein, that looks to essentially reconstitute a grant program, the neighborhood stabilization program that was used post-global financial crisis. The idea would be to create a new neighborhood stabilization program and provide those fundings, flexible funding similar to CDBG, to cities that enact zoning reform. If they promise to enact zoning reform, then they get these new sort of flexible spending dollars. So that's another example of a carrot that's been introduced. So, so just as far as a landscape of what we're seeing on the Hill, we're seeing a lot of volume as far as pro-housing legislation. Legislation, again, really focused not just on creating more resource for the production of affordable housing, but really thinking about how can we encourage and support, and in some cases cajole, local communities to modernize and reform outdated, outmoded, and exclusionary zoning codes. Last thing I'll say is what it's not. As opposed to other countries, you know, from, I think, to some extent, the UK, certainly places like Canada, where there's more of a national level of control over zoning, no one in Congress has appetite for a nationalized zoning code or any sort of push-down mandates on states. And I think certainly if you were to look at, you know, Wyoming versus Colorado versus California versus Delaware, you know, the communities are so different from one another, it's tough to imagine that type of one-size-fits-all solution. I'd be interested in Alan's thoughts on this, because I know you've done a ton of research across the globe on different regulatory regimes from that standpoint. But currently there's really no appetite. It really comes down to, are we going to incentivize outcomes? Are we going to provide resources to enable communities to drive locally driven solutions? Or are we going to, you know, take more of a stick approach and say, look, if you want to continue to receive transportation funding, for example, you know, you have to affirmatively take certain actions. You know, this is akin to the National Highway Safety Act, the National Drinking Age Act, which kind of, you know, connected some really tight strings on continued receipt of highway trust fund dollars. So there is precedent for that, but that's as far sort of on the heavy-handed side as we have seen any federal legislators willing to go. And even with that, as this diagram, I think, you know, illustrates, you know, there's not much runway for those ideas to move forward. And then I'll end with, and then really I'm going to hand it over to Taylor to facilitate conversation. But I'll end with some emerging proposals, food for thought, right? So there's 4 kind of emerging ideas that we are working on and working with legislative champions on developing. The first, most advanced, came out in the president's budget, I guess a couple of weeks ago now, the Housing Supply Fund. Now, this is exciting. We just submitted a letter today on this proposal. This is a $50 billion appropriations request out of the HUD budget. It's President's budget to Congress. It's just a wish list. That's all it is, right? And Congress is going to go write the budget and make whatever choice points they will make. But this is an exciting proposal that we think pushes the envelope further than that $1.5 billion Housing Supply and Affordability Act, insofar as it's roughly, I want to say, $25 billion for funds for affordable housing production directly, and it's another $10 billion for eliminating artificial barriers to affordable housing development. And what's in that $10 billion? Well, it's somewhat of a mashup of the Klobuchar legislation, which is money for technical assistance, staff capacity to do the technical work to update zoning codes, and community engagement. But it's another bucket of money to provide things like money for water sewer retrofit of infrastructure to serve community growth, thinking about transportation needs and perhaps adding transportation capacity. In the provision, it's structured as roads, but I think it's not unreasonable to imagine that it could fund transportation demand management policy development, perhaps fixed guideway, leveraging programs like capital improvement grants from FTA. So it's really trying to take the arguments against housing off the table, those arguments that we often hear neighborhood defenders invoking when they're saying, no, we want affordable housing in our community, but it's the parking, it's the transportation, it's the lack of infrastructure. Well, this is the federal government, this is the administration essentially saying, well, we're gonna take care of that for you if you're putting forward housing forward policies, so you basically have no excuse. So that's the Housing Supply Fund. Number two, the Home Act, I talked about a bit earlier. That bill is getting ready for its third reintroduction. We're providing some technical assistance to Senator Booker and Congressman Clyburn's office on that. We're in discussions with the idea of harmonizing requirements and program calibration between things like the housing tax credit and the historic tax credit, programs that should work together to produce much more housing, but with inconsistent requirements and inconsistent processes often get stymied and just don't happen as a result. And then finally, a growing conversation around commercial to residential redevelopment. And up for growth on the C3 side, we're publishing a policy brief later this year to inform federal legislative development around the idea of either through tax policy or direct appropriations, trying to bring forward the conversion of a lot of vacant or underutilized commercial office into residential uses. It's that could be an hour on its own as far as a conversation. But just if it's helpful, that's where we see the conversation heading on the Hill. But I'll just say thank you for listening. Hopefully this has been informative as to the state of play. We really want to use this time to tap the collective expertise in this room, because Up for Growth and Up for Growth Action really works hard to stay close to change makers on the ground who are actually doing the advocacy, doing the lobbying for either statewide pro-housing legislation or city level zoning reform policy work. And we view our role as federal advocates as what should we be focusing on to create the conditions where pro-housing advocates at the state and local level can be most successful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Taylor to kind of guide us through a conversation.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I have a list of questions for folks, but I just wanted to add a couple of things on the HUD side before we jump into the conversation, because I feel like that helps to kind of round out the conversation on the Hill. But in the HUD policy space, Secretary Fudge recently released the strategic plan for HUD, and three of the main priority areas are the racial homeownership gap, voucher utilization, and then HUD is working on redoing the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is going to be really essential to this conversation about equitable development of affordable housing and equitable distribution of affordable housing at the local level. And then I'm sure folks were probably thinking about Build Back Better, and Mike has a way better sense of the current politics at play there, but that would have been a historic investment in public and affordable housing that didn't move forward, that also included some really key low-income housing tax credit changes. How many of y'all are from Oregon or are in Oregon? So in Oregon, we're dangerously close to approaching our private activity bond cap. which basically is a tool that is used with the low-income housing tax credit to develop affordable housing. And we're really lucky in this state to have a lot of gap resources to help us with that development. But approaching the PAB cap will definitely have an impact on our ability to keep moving the pipeline forward. And so that's why those federal changes are so important to production on the ground. So I just wanted to add a couple things before moving us to questions. So the first, again, like Mike said, we want this to be a really generative conversation in the room to help inform the policy agenda and strategic priorities for Up for Growth. So the first question for you all is to just discuss with the person next to you, what are the primary barriers to achieving equitable housing outcomes in your communities? And then from there, we'll kind of talk about the federal government's role. So to start with the person next to you, about 3 minutes, groups of 2 or 3, primary barriers to achieving equitable housing outcomes. You might have to define what that means for your group, but go for it. That was awesome. You killed it. Sorry to jump in. I was just like, oh, I want to say.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I totally skipped over being
Oh, a whole thing. No. And I figured that most people would just. I have no idea at this point what there seems to be. Probably won't have any housing in it. Yeah, probably not. So
we're working on it, and the community is working on it. My thinking is we have a better shot at budget FY23 budget legislation. That's next fiscal year. And so if we can get even at the 20% president's proposal, it's going to actually be even. I don't know on the whole more than BBB, but in fact be a considerable bite at the apple.
Yep, fingers crossed.
And there's going to be tax extenders, so the 50% test issue is something we're also
I know, it's huge. Huge. I know, we're scrambling. I mean, we need the 25% test rule like immediately. We're having some really difficult conversations about how we manage the pipeline at the state level.
Are you part of the volunteer citizen advisory group over tax credit allocation? No, like I think all states have like a tax credit advisory committee. Like I know California does. Presumably Oregon does.
We have like a past committee that was 3 people, but I don't think that's the next thing.
Like governor appointees.
Yeah, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's all governor appointees. A lot of it is not, yeah.
So I'm impressed that you've done so much work.
Yeah.
Great, I thought it was going to be fun.
It's good to hear.
Good thing. I know. So I feel back to the folks that are live streaming can't engage in the conversation, but maybe we can repeat back. Maybe give it like another couple of minutes and then we'll come back. Okay.
Let's give it another minute, because you have a lot of questions too.
I do. I know. So maybe give it another.
And then do you want me to take notes since you're facilitating?
That would be great.
Okay, can I borrow that?
Yeah. Here. Do you have a pen?
I can have, oh, yeah.
It's okay. Use that one. So use it. Yeah. Yep. No, I wonder, do you want me to, should I list this and show what the questions are, or just read them one at a time?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, I don't know how we can, maybe we can ask these folks to turn on. These are always like some
I know you don't want it to go like this.
All right. I love the lively discussion. Let's bring it back to the group. Okay. Would a couple of volunteers be willing to share what you all talked about in your groups? And I'm sorry if not everybody got an opportunity to share. Yeah.
Sean and I agreed that the issue wasn't so much policy, but power. Who owns power in local communities?
Interesting.
And how it's exercised, whether it's when elections are held, or how elections are held, and who votes.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
that then drives everything else.
Great. So kind of especially, are you talking about local government level, like city level politics and who has power?
City level politics, single-family homeowners vote, and they particularly vote a lot when elections are held in odd years, as compared to, like, say, presidential years.
Yes, there's a lot of great research about the role, the important role of state government in particular in response to some of the local political dynamics that can really prevent inclusionary zoning work to be done. That's awesome. Thank you. How about for other folks? Yeah.
I think just to piggyback on that, one thing we had talked about in our group was also sustained people power. So as you know, politics shift, being able to have a consistent voice saying like Yumby or whatever the policy may be.
Awesome. Okay, so local advocacy efforts, just supporting those specifically. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So Michael and I coincidentally were thinking some of the same things. We're thinking a little bit about the demand side. And I'll just add some thoughts, I'll drill in a little bit. But to me, it seemed like Republican, Democrat, we know this country's politics has moved to the right, so they both seem to be kind of gelling on buy side kind of things. But the stimulus in the last 2 years has shown us the promise of demand side, especially the child tax credits and the stimulus to unemployed. And so that created, ironically, maybe a lowering of the income inequality gap, but it also created a lot of cash that ended up maybe trickling over into the real estate markets, which we know created an affordability issue. So how do you do stimulus on the demand side, but ensure affordability? So like we were talking about non-project-based stimulus and support for housing. And so we were, ironically, just randomly sitting there and thinking about the same thing. So at the federal level, what could that look like? And it seemed like maybe more of a Democrat thing, although the original stimulus came out under the Trump administration. So what are the politics there?
Yeah. I'm not surprised at all that your group jumped. I feel like y'all jumped ahead to the federal. What the role of federal government? No, I'm not surprised. You're in the weeds, very much in the policy weeds. So I'm not surprised by the genius of that pairing.
Not question at the local level. I'm not.
That's great. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay. Anybody else want to share? Yeah.
So we did, primary barriers, zoning, permitting, obviously.
Yep.
But then we were kind of thinking about, especially the federal government, and how all of the fears around public housing led to low-income housing tax. The complications, like doing affordable housing, and the funding, and the compliance, and the amount of cost burden that puts on affordable housing developers is really makes our dollars go very short amount. So we get way less per dollar than we otherwise would. And then the additional locally, but also federal level, we're always asking affordable housing developers to do even more than we ask market rate developers to do. We're asking them this like gray water system and a jobs program, and they have to do this, and they have to do that.
Yep.
That really drives up the cost of affordable and makes those precious affordable dollars amount to like millions.
Yes, gosh, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And for folks who aren't in the affordable housing development space, you have to blend so many different financing sources. And there was I think in Oregon, we did a study about what are the drivers of cost of affordable housing, because that's a common sort of political conversation to push back on investing in affordable housing, is that it's more expensive to build. But the regulatory requirements you just mentioned, especially around subsidy layering, are huge. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to add in also, we didn't quite get to this, but especially that layer cake of funding makes affordable housing even more vulnerable when people try to fuck with the permit. That because you've got all of these timing,
Yes.
all of your layer cake of funding, you're even more afraid of NIMBYism, and it makes affordable housing not get proposed in places because they're like, well, we'll never get through the permitting process and make sure that we can get our funding lined up. Like those two things intersect to a great degree.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that into the conversation. That's so critical. Awesome. Well, thank you all for that generative conversation around barriers. And the next question, similarly, just kind of turn and talk with your group about it. So of the barriers that you discussed, what role do you think the federal government could most effectively play to address those barriers? So Mike talked kind of about what the current Overton window is for federal policy, but given the barriers that you identified, are those the right buckets, or do we need to be focusing on shifting me over to window towards accountability, for example. So the questions are also up on the board, but what role could or should the federal government play in addressing the specific barriers, and are they incentives, accountability, transparency, investments, all of the above, or something different? So go for it. Do another 2 to 3 minutes, then we'll come back.
Can I use your laptop to type these up?
local governments appropriately have we have a principal in-town focus on zoning regulation. The federal government has only mediated impact on those things. And it's appropriate and exciting that we're focused on that. But the federal government has direct control over federal taxes and over the regulation of mortgage finance, which are the ways those are the principal ways that the federal government influences housing. We spend something like 5 times as much, directly or indirectly, on mortgage finance through the tax code and regulation of banking systems than we do through all HUD programs combined. So that's where our conversation went. And we're thinking a lot about a likely midterm red wave when we'll end up with divided government. And in 2017, the Trump tax reform actually was the most progressive change in the mortgage interest policy and the capital gains policy and the taxation of local property, the federal tax treatment of local property taxes that we've had maybe ever. And so I'm wondering if there's any path in the kind of jujitsu, weird, Yumby, cross-partisan coalition strategy after the midterms, which probably is not going to close a bunch of doors, but might those doors open to engage on that side.
So that's more, I would say, on the incentive side. So tax code specific changes to incentivize development of housing.
So if Upper Growth could take care of that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. Yeah, we'll punt that to Mike. He's got it. It's going to happen. Thank you for that, Alan.
Integration of housing policy. Mike, you want it?
Super easy. Thank you, Alan. Other groups, what did folks talk about? Yeah.
We talked about making Section 8 and entitlement.
Woo!
Because it's like speaking on the ground at Section 8 higher ed, the manager one, it says, the wait list only opens up 3 to 5 years, and then it takes about 3 to 5 years to get pulled off the wait list. And in that time, like people's phone numbers change, they left, and replace families, they might move. So it takes about, I'd say, it's a 30 to 1 ratio of pulling off that wait list before we actually get someone that can get into an apartment. So just having entitlement, having that pipeline, and actually being able to get them into houses without losing the contact.
Awesome. That's a great one. Thank you. I know we're clapping for that. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, how about other folks? Go ahead.
One thing that, maybe more on the symbolic side, otherwise it's fair class amendment repeal, which
Yes.
I'd be curious from y'all to hear what the status of that was. But one thing I think in general that the federal government can do is not even pass any of these policies, just talk about it more to give cover to local trade and state and local activists. AOC coming out on her recent Yumby tax is almost certainly going to pay dividends in our activism in New York City and our ability to win over other organizations, even if nothing changes at the federal level. Just important national politicians talking about it.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and on the fair cloth side, I'm not sure about the sort of political feasibility of fair cloth repeal, so I'll turn that to Mike. But just on there's a lot of guidance right now for public housing authorities to do fair cloth to RAD, which basically enables under the fair cloth cap to do more RAD development, so using Section 8 stream to develop deeply affordable housing. So if they have any fair cloth left, which is exciting. So I think there's going to be a big push in the next couple of years for fair cloth to RAD developments. Yeah.
One thing we talked about was, and this is something I think we see at the state and local level in a lot of different places, is that we don't want to pass things that don't have any enforcement. And so I think there is some concern about if we pass, concern. I would swallow my concern. If we pass federal upzoning mandates, which I would obviously be for, we would then need to have a national movement that made sure that
for bringing in the accountability enforcement piece. It's so important. Even if the Overton window isn't there yet, it's such a critical piece, because I feel like thinking about House Bill 2001 in Oregon, which was our middle housing bill, we had some sticks kind of built into that, and it's very clear that you can't do an incentive-based model only because local jurisdictions that are the most exclusionary don't need carrots, you know? So like if they're fine without carrots, then you've got to have sticks and enforcement on the other side. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying, on that for accountability, that like for the AFFH rule, like even under the Obama administration, I jokingly called it the affirmatively reporting on unfair housing, because it's basically like you can do a racism as long as you write a book report about it, basically, like, and that was as far that was the boldest thing that they were able to do, and that's still the Trump administration goal that day, and so then like is that transparency like the first step in enforcement, or
I think there's a lot of potential too with a new wave of AFFH policy that's going to be forthcoming to think about how to tie pro-housing regulations within that rulemaking. So when that the draft rule comes out, making sure that your organizations or you as individuals are paying attention and weighing in on that. Because I think about in Oregon, I don't know if Lorelei is still here, but working on the House Bill, so our state worked to do an Oregon housing needs analysis, which Lorelei has really been a technical expert in leading. In that, yay, come to the presentation tomorrow. But in that work, it's about how does the state set housing production goals that local jurisdictions are then held accountable to. But the conversation around how does this framework incorporate AFFH and affirmatively furthering for housing. So so there's a lot there, but that's really great. So we're going to skip over the third question because we don't have as much time. But the next question, this is a big one for me, and I'm excited to hear what y'all think. So in Oregon and Portland, one of the major challenges that comes up when doing sort of pro-housing or zoning reform to increase production is the very real concern around displacement. And what can the federal government do to support local jurisdictions who are thinking about doing zoning reform to prevent displacement? Personally, I would love if there were anti-displacement vouchers, but I'm curious what you all think. So a couple minutes with the people next to you to think about what should the federal government's role be in preventing displacement for communities that are doing zoning reform. Go for it.
One thing that we struggle with at San Francisco.
Yeah, the AFFH process is moving forward, and that's a conversation we need to have soon. About how we can be a major player in that conversation and really push to have, because he's absolutely right about
And that's going to be something that if it does get
It's hard to ask someone else to see how to understand. Can you explain to the group like what the economics of that thing is? Because I really wasn't following.
Sure, yes, I can do that at the next one. Yes. Sorry. That's actually a good one, is thinking about for fair cost of rent, like encouraging people to advocate in their local communities to check and see if their public housing authority has like room under the fair cost cap. Because you can basically pursue additional Section 8 resources to bring to the community.
okay.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about fair cost amendment. I mean, I've read it was an AOC bill, right? Or at least she was talking about it.
Repealing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Do you know like functionally what it is?
I mean, I forget. It's been a while since I looked at that issue.
It puts a hard cap on the number of public housing units that a public housing authority can develop, and so
Got it.
yeah, it basically means that you can't build more than a certain amount of public housing units, and so for some public housing authorities they have not built to their cap. So the repeal of it is basically like we shouldn't limit the number of public housing units that communities should have. It hasn't realistically been as much of a rub because we don't have as much money going into public housing development, but it came up a lot around the Build Back Better Act where they were putting money into the public housing capital and operating fund. So it was like, okay, well, we're putting more money towards public housing, so we should really lift the fair cost cap on how many units public housing authorities can build.
Yeah.
But in the absence of that, some public housing authorities haven't built all the way up to their cap, and they can now do a conversion to say, instead of building public housing units, we want to do RAD, so we can pull down the Section 8 funding to basically be deeply affordable in the way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so that is.
Or build more like RAD units. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And the distinction with RAD is that it's a public-private partnership, right?
Yes. Public-private partnership, you can bring in financing that you can't in the same way that you do with like Section 8 base, where you can also
that
mostly
seems like,
understand.
yeah, that seems like a fairly, now, is there any Republican support to elimination of fair housing tax? Or no, because they're saying, like, we don't want to invest in public housing writ large?
I think so. I think that's what, I mean, that's what it seems like to me, is that it seems like there's a lot more support for, like, expanding the voucher program and then project basing vouchers. So, yeah, I'm gonna just like Google quickly to make sure that I'm explaining that the right way. Okay. Yeah. So it's basically a strategy that provides financing. Okay. All right. So I'm sure you all solved displacement during that 2 to 3 minute conversation. No big deal. Before we jump into hearing report backs for folks, I just got a request to kind of explain the Fair Cloth to RAD amendment piece. Sorry to wonk out on that, but so essentially the Fair Cloth limits public housing authorities in developing public housing. So it's basically a unit number cap on how much can be developed. The Fair Cloth to RAD is basically a process that would allow PHAs to pull down like Section 8 financing to develop more deeply affordable units. So just as a highlight for folks, so there's existing federal authority to provide deep rental assistance for nearly 220,000 units across the country. So I would highly encourage folks to look for like your local public housing authority, look if they have room left under their Fair Cloth amendment, and ask them if they're planning on using this program called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program to pull those deeply affordable resources into the community. So that is a little bit of background. Sorry to wonk out on that piece. Happy to talk more about it afterwards. So what did folks talk about in terms of what could the federal government do to prevent displacement in support of local zoning reform efforts? Yeah.
We talked about opportunities for supporting rental registries.
Okay.
So, maybe funding pilot programs or providing, technical expertise, monetary incentives to adopt these.
Awesome. That's great. Talk to me a little bit about if you having a rental registry, the role that would play in preventing displacement.
Yeah, so the idea is that it becomes much harder for landlords to essentially violate tenant protections. So, evictions and leases all have to go through a rental registry.
Wonderful.
Yeah, everything's transparency, right?
That's awesome. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, sure. Go
There
ahead.
are a lot of cities that are remote exploring, upzoning, and highly cost-constrained places are already, maybe even already have on the book tenant protection, demolition control, or they already have on the book other protections, but are, because all the burden lives on the tenant to actually know how to enforce their rights, you don't end up having those actually work. And so if there were a rental registry, you could have both like transparent, like a municipal and then the like, what could we get across the finish line, like transparency, and also the ability for them, this like third-party mechanism where the bureaucracy enforces the tenant protections without the tenant even having to say, excuse me, I would like to have rights, please. So a lot of them are already on the books.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. I see Henry. Sorry, I don't know everyone's name. So go Henry, here, and then here. Okay.
We talked about a couple of things, one of which was, right now when we look about modeling displacement, say in the residential infill project in Portland, that's displacement based on demolitions alone, and not displacement from rent increases that come from not increasing supply. Part of that's so we just don't have an agreement across the country of what's the impact in a growing market on displacement of not building new housing. It'd be really useful for the federal government to have a federal standard of, if you're growing by this much, we expect you to be experiencing this much displacement. If you add this much housing supply, we expect that to have this impact on displacement. So we can even just understand what's happening, so that we can think about zoning reform either increasing displacement or oftentimes decreasing displacement.
Yes.
And understanding that part better.
Yeah, so it's like that counterfactual piece, and Henry's more of an expert on residential infill project, but there was a study that showed what would be the rate of displacement in the absence of doing residential infill, because we often talk about the displacement impact of zoning reform, but not, as I understand what you're saying, the displacement impact of not doing anything, like of the status quo.
And I think it was still just demolition based.
Yep.
displacement, which is like maybe 20% of actual displacement
Yep.
or less. Right?
Okay, so federal support for studies like that at the local level to kind of paint a picture of what really is going on with displacement and production.
Yeah, or even just the standard of what happens in different types of markets when you don't build it when you do.
Awesome, awesome. I hear that as like funding Miriam Zook at the UC Berkeley Anti-Displacement Center, maybe. Awesome, thank you. All right, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I'm from Alaska, so just speaking a bit to the rural displacement, a lot of that is due to really high cost of transportation for materials to get to places, to get to build houses. And in Alaska, we're pretty extreme. As an example, we have 80% of our villages aren't accessible by road.
Wow.
So we have to fly in materials or bargain materials. So HUD programs can help subsidize that in terms of getting those materials there.
Awesome.
Number one. Number two, I think also the Community Reinvestment Act is really sometimes helpful and also sometimes not helpful, and can help increase the rate of gentrification in communities that have been classified as low to moderate income. And so changing that assessment so it, rather than going by community, it's by the actual person applying for the mortgage. And going through the OCC as well as our elected leaders.
Thank you so much for coming down from Alaska and for bringing that perspective. That's a totally different housing market. Yeah, I know. Thanks a lot. All of our trees are breaking. Thank you. Okay, yeah, you had
I just
something.
wanted to add on to the sort of runway entry conversation, because there's something I also brought up, which was that that's something that's going to be a terrible patchwork of technology across all of the cities of America, and that seems like an obvious national standard that could be implemented just as it's gaining steam and power, the way because Portland may be the first city to do it.
Yep.
And it's going to tear people, activists, and think tanks' hair out in 5 years if we end up with totally different ways of reporting and implementing this in varying different data quality.
Yep, that's a great reason to do it at the national level. Thank you.
It's
Appreciate
also
that.
incredibly expensive and time consuming,
To build the technology for it.
and just to maintain it.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much. All right, in the back here.
Well, one thing our group talked about a little bit on that point is that the opportunity zones legislation under the public text of had its GIS-based evaluation of every census tract based on some kind of socioeconomic indicator, I don't know what it was, where investments in those zones, literally census tracts, got preference under absolute you also mentioned more than. So we were thinking there could be demand side, like housing vouchers that are worth more in those zones, or something where you're targeted, or maybe supply side more tax credits, something that's more like state, but
Yeah.
where it's earmarked for the well-defined under a national census type, easy to analyze displacement risk indicator of some sort. Could be change in rent, or could be some kind of socioeconomic indicator that's more stable under the census or ACS type data that's easier to get, a proxy for displacement rate.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes me think a lot about the need as well for kind of housing choice voucher reform. So in addition to making it a universal program, like how do we, like you brought up, linking better to the cost of a particular area and how housing choice vouchers are, folks, they don't get the greatest bang per buck given like the way that payment standards work. So if we did housing choice voucher improvement, so we could use those as actual anti-displacement mechanisms. So as the value's going up in an area, folks don't get priced out, because voucher holders also get priced out of communities for sure. Yeah, one of the mechanisms we can use for that. Okay, any other thoughts, last minute thoughts on, I saw a hand go up and then down. Yeah.
I mean, I do think, like, source of income discrimination is something that could quickly be made illegal at the federal level, and I say quickly while knowing that that's probably possible. But, Mike, if you could do that, just make source of income discrimination illegal, that would be awesome.
He's taken great notes, excellent notes on all of these things for the upcoming discussions around the Upper Growth agenda. So with that, I know that we're very close to time, so I just wanted to, I know we didn't get through all of the questions here. We wanted to talk a little bit about how the federal government should hold exclusionary jurisdictions accountable. If those of you have not read The Color of Law, I would highly recommend it. It kind of creates the legal case for the role, the necessary role of the federal government in addressing segregation by income and race that they help to create through the federal housing policies, many of which are still kind of being implemented through old rules. So we didn't get to that, but just wanted to thank you all. There's so much expertise and brain power in this room, and we will look through all of these notes, and please get engaged with Up for Growth, because we'll be developing this agenda based on your feedback, and I'll turn it over to Mike to close this out.
No, thank you. Thank you, Taylor, for facilitating this great session. Thank you to you all for your insights and perspectives here. We are absolutely going to use this as we move our legislative agenda development forward. And just real quick, so out of all the, who here is connected to Up for Growth as a member or associated with the organization that's a member? Okay, cool. So if you're not yet engaged with Up for Growth, or you don't know you are, just come to me, and we'd be happy to have a conversation, see if we can create more opportunities to get you all engaged throughout this year. So really appreciate the time. We are also, just so everybody knows, we're holding an event tonight at 4:30 to 6:30 at Loyal Legion. So if anybody's interested in just learning more and continuing the conversation there, we'd love to have you. So yeah, it's been great. Really appreciate it. We have. Oh, sorry. Loyal Legion. And come give me your card or email address, and I'll send you the information if anybody here is interested in stopping by. But thank you again. This has been really great. And I think one last question. I would be happy to give you share that. Yeah, and we'll talk with Aaron to see if we can get it out to all the attendees as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.